One of my favorite books of the last 10 years was Unbroken by Laura Hillenbrand. It's the truly astounding story of Louis Zamperini, who was born to an immigrant Italian family. And Zamperini started his life as a juvenile delinquent and was widely expected to end up in catastrophic trouble. Instead, he ended up on the track team and became the best high school miler in the state. After only 4 college races, he was selected for the 1936 Olympic team. He didn't medal, but he had a last lap in the 5,000-meter race that shattered every last lap record in the books. He met Hitler, who called him the boy with the fast finish. Zamperini's true triumph was supposed to come in the 1940 Olympics, but they never happened. Instead, with his generation, Zamperini joined World War II. He became a bombardier, trained at Ellington Field, and he flew in B-24s in the Pacific. He participated in the first bombing of Wake Island, and after another flight over the little island of Nauru, Zamperini's plane returned with 3 dead crew members and with 594 holes in it. And then, on a simple search for a downed plane, Zamperini's aircraft lost 2 engines and spiraled into the ocean. All but 3 crewmen died, and those 3 crawled into 2 ill-equipped life rafts and began an epic 47-day journey pursued by sharks, starvation, a typhoon, and mostly thirst. One of the 3 didn't make it, but Zamperini and Phil Phillips floated more than 2,000 miles before they found an island, which turned out to be in the hands of the Japanese. After their capture, the Americans were taken to one of the horrid POW camps that the Japanese had established. For 2 full years, Zamperini endured criminal torture, singled out because of his celebrity, and especially hated by a Japanese captor nicknamed the Bird. The tortures, too numerous, too graphic to describe here, were accompanied by starvation rations, infested living conditions, and mental abuse. But Zamperini survived to the end of the war. He was so physically wasted then that he could not ever run competitively again. He was so mentally wasted that he couldn't adjust. Though he married, he descended into alcohol and violence, consumed by nightly nightmares of hatred for his captors, and especially of the Bird. Now, you would say that Zamperini's life, based on this brief description, could be seen as overrun by plague after plague of what we saw last week as locusts. Wave after wave of terrorizing and debilitating events rolled over him, the details too numerous, too horrid to name. But we'll hear toward the end of the sermon that Zamperini cried out for help, and at key moments he received unexplainable, saving help from God. So this week, as we continue to study Joel, we find that the first thing we do in response to the locusts of our lives is to cry out. And we're not surprised by this. We remember from Psalm 143 that the first stage of lament is crying out. And in Joel 1:13-20, we'll find this truth again. And I want to emphasize it again, because I believe that crying out is the first essential step in response to any life situation, whether difficulty or opportunity. Too often we go numbly into sin or despair, unresponsive in this key thing, that individually and as a community, we are called to cry out to God. So let's read the text, and then we'll see who is to cry out and how. Joel 1:13-20. Put on sackcloth and lament, O priests. Wail, O ministers of the altar. Go in, pass the night in sackcloth, O ministers of my God, because grain offering and drink offering are withheld from the house of your God. Consecrate a fast. Call a solemn assembly. Gather the elders and all the inhabitants to the house of the Lord your God, and cry out to the Lord. Alas for the day! For the day of the Lord is near, and as destruction from the Almighty it comes. Is not the food cut off before our eyes, joy and gladness from the house of our God? The seed shrivels under the clods. The storehouses are desolate. The granaries are torn down because the grain has dried up. How the beasts groan. The herds of cattle are perplexed because there is no pasture for them. Even the flocks of sheep suffer. To you, O God, I call, for the fire has devoured the pastures of the wilderness, and flame has burned all the trees of the field. Even the beasts of the field pant for you, because the water brooks are dried up, and fire has devoured the pastures of the wilderness. So verse 13 is directed, kind of point one, to the priests and ministers of the people, and calls them to mourn and to lament. Sackcloth, as I said, was the traditional garment of mourning in Israel, not wildly different from this burlap that I used with the children's corner. By its intentional discomfort and also its visible poverty, it was an outward sign of the inward reality of grief, accompanied by lament and wailing. So our English language, like all languages, is rich in many ways, but it's deficient in others. The Hebrew Old Testament, for example, has more than a dozen words, I think 16 on the slide that you'll see, with meanings like lament and mourn and grieve, and with meanings that show the inward reality of loss, and others like wail and cry out that show the outward manifestation of loss. But it's hard to match our few English words to the more varied Hebrew's words. The word translated lament, as an example, is translated by the English Standard Version as lament about 15 times. 15 other times it's translated as mourn. And then last week, as we started Joel, we saw another English word, lament, in verse 8. But that wasn't this word. It was another Hebrew word that has been translated lament. In today's verse, there's another word the ESV translates wail, and that word is somewhat more closely associated with the verbal expression of grief and loss, and Joel uses that word 3 times in chapter 1. So there's this major overlap in English between the distinct Hebrew words, and that means that the nuances of those words can be lost in our English translation. And yet I think even to us the meaning is clear. The leaders of God's people are to mourn, grieve, and lament inwardly, to cry out and wail outwardly. The leaders we're seeing here are the priests and ministers of the altar, probably one group of people, not two, named twice for emphasis. So these priests were those who were set apart to bring sacrifices and offerings to God in the tabernacle and then the temple. They were to be holy, set apart in ways more demanding than the people, but they had this incredible privilege of entering the holy place and serving in God's presence. They had no secular profession, but along with the Levites, they were dedicated to the service of the Lord. That is, they were ministers or servants of the altar, offering not only animal sacrifices, but also the grain offerings and offerings of incense and fragrant oil. So this word minister simply means the one who serves, and the overwhelming use of it is in the service of the priests and the Levites. But here those same people are called to spend whole nights in lament, wailing, mourning, and grieving. And what were they to lament? Judgment or calamity, these plagues of locust and drought. They were to wail because the grain offering and drink offering that they were commanded to give daily had now been withheld. So as I looked at this word wail in all of its Old Testament references, it was always the response to judgment or calamity. It was not the response to awareness of sin. Repentance, turning to God, prayer, and other things do show up frequently as the response of God's people to their sin. But once the calamity shows up, or God's judgment begins, it is then that they are commanded to wail and lament, grieve, and cry out. In fact, this book of Joel never tells us about the specific sins that may have brought this judgment or calamity. The book, as I said last week, is universal. It doesn't ever condemn specific sin, but it says that when the locusts of life come, whether they are judgment or calamity, we cry out to God. We also, I think, symbolically at least, put on sackcloth. We examine ourselves for sin. We mourn the losses of our nation, the calamities of a fallen world. And in Israel, the leaders of that were to be the priests and elders of the people. So too in the present day, the leaders of God's people, the ministers and elders of God's churches, should feel the first responsibility to mourn, to grieve, to cry out to God in the face of calamity or judgment. This must include recognizing and repenting of our own sins, but it also includes lamenting the pain simply brought by the locusts. So is COVID-19 a judgment? We don't know that it is. We do know that our country, our culture, and even many of our church practices are ripe for judgment. And yet, without drawing that straight line of cause and effect, I believe Joel calls the leaders of this church and of the church nationwide and worldwide to mourn, to cry out, to lament COVID-19 in particular, not just the disease, but all of the impacts that this thing is having socially, economically, and politically. The same could be said for racial injustice and the violence rampant in so many cities. Leaders grieve when they see these things, and they see the judgment that may lie behind it. We grieve. We grieve abortion. We grieve sexual sin. We grieve oppression. We cry out to God. And yet the leaders in Joel's day and in ours were also responsible to call the people to cry out. Second point Joel makes is that we cry out in community. Verse 14, consecrate a fast, call a solemn assembly, gather the elders and all the inhabitants of the land to the house of the Lord your God, and cry out to the Lord. I have no doubt that the priests and the other leaders are to take this responsibility. They're to call the people to fasting and prayer. Fasting, of course, has been a response to calamity and sin throughout the history of God's people. When Nehemiah learned of the state of Jerusalem, that calamity, he says, as soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. Daniel does the same thing. So does David. At one point, the prophet Samuel calls the whole nation to this kind of solemn fasting and prayer. More recently, in the history of the church, there have been many solemn calls to fasting and prayer. And some of the greatest revivals in history have been given by God as the church has done this together. I urge you to read or listen to J. Edwin Orr's famous speech, The Role of Prayer in Spiritual Awakening. It's an amazing short speech with compelling examples of God's response to corporate prayer. And we do know that in the Old Testament there is criticism of fasting that's done wrong, that's merely external or trying to manipulate God. Jesus warns against fasting for public recognition, but the warnings do not negate the value of fasting, which is to focus our prayers on the needs before us, often with mourning and grieving and corporate crying out. So he says, gather the elders and all the inhabitants of the land and cry out to the Lord. The words cry out translate in another Hebrew word, za'ak. The Theological Word Book says the basic meaning of this root is to cry for help in times of distress. So here at Trinity, we've not done much corporate fasting, though many of us do fast, and we do suggest it from time to time to the body. But what we do and have since the beginning is call for corporate prayer and petition before God. This has been the purpose recently of the Tuesday night prayer time, We started it after we began to reopen. We've been simply gathering right here to pray that this COVID mess and the other messes in our culture would be met by God with revival and with mercy. You ought to come and pray with your brothers and sisters if you're able. It's our version of a solemn assembly. Verses 15 to 18 record the actual cry of the community. Like the lamenting and wailing of the last section, the cry is not necessarily one of repentance, but of grieving over judgment and calamity. Verse 15, alas for the day of the Lord is near, and as destruction from the Almighty it comes. Alas in the Hebrew is like a guttural cry. Maybe, something like that. It's often translated woe. And the cry is focused on the day of the Lord, which is near. That day is a major theme in Joel. Well, we're going to focus on it next week. For now, all we need to know is that most of the prophets look forward to a final day of judgment and rescue at God's hand. Some emphasize the beauty of God's rescue in that day. Some emphasize the horror of the final judgment of that day. And many of the prophets, like Joel, saw their current circumstances as foreshadowing or possibly leading directly to that ultimate day of judgment. Thinking together about this locust plague and about this drought, the people of God can only conclude that that day is near and that destruction from the Almighty, the judgment of the Almighty, it comes. And they point to good evidence. Verse 16. Is not the food cut off before our eyes, joy and gladness from the house of our God? We mentioned last week that this drought had also dried up the gladness of men. And in the same way, any of the locusts of life can dry up joy and gladness. I'm not saying they necessarily have to, or even necessarily that they should, but they can do that, and they do that in many cases. The locusts we're experiencing, COVID-19 and these other things, have threatened to cut off joy and gladness for many. I know I've felt it myself. Verse 17, the seed shrivels under the clods, the storehouses are desolate, the granaries are torn down because the grain is dried up. The seed, say that 5 times fast, the seed shrivels under the clods, or maybe the word is shovels. It's really visual. They're saying we plant the seeds, and instead of sprouting because there's no spring rain, we look under the dirt to cover them and find the seeds themselves have shriveled. This drought has been so bad for so long that the storehouses are desolate, useless. They're taking them down to use the materials for other things. Verse 18, how the beasts groan. The herds of cattle are perplexed because there is no pasture for them. Even the flocks of sheep suffer. I love the personification there of the beasts. This is so bad that the cattle are scratching their heads and groaning. Now, as far as I know, cattle don't do that, but it sure does bring across the desperation the people are in. And notice the detail. Notice the feeling of this cry. When God's people come together to cry out in distress, they don't sugarcoat the pain. They give voice to the fear. They detail the calamity. They lament, which means that their cry includes an implied why and an implied how long. So the leaders cry out on behalf of the people. They call the community together to cry out. And finally, each of us individually should cry out. Verses 19 and 20. To you, O Lord, I call, for fire has devoured the pastures of the wilderness, and flame has burned all the trees of the field. Even the beasts of field pant for you, because the water brooks are dried up, and fire has devoured the pastures of the wilderness. So the main difference between these two verses and the ones before them is that the author switches from we, community, to I. To you, O Lord, I call. So when our leaders and our community cries out, it is our responsibility to call out to God as well. The leaders lament and grieve, the community cries out, and we as individuals call on God and cry out to Him for rescue. The community lament is specific, And this individual call is also specific. Fire has devoured the pastures of the wilderness. Flame has burned all the trees of the field. It's very possible that the locusts and the drought have led to this third plague of fire. The dead and dried husks of once green vegetation would make for abundant fuel. In California, where the drought, which has continued for years more or less unabated, has led to many wildfires, and these are so uncontrollable again this year. And in Scripture, fire is often a metaphor for judgment. In Amos chapter 1, God says, I will send a fire upon the wall of Gaza, and it shall devour her strongholds. And then in that same couple chapters, he says the same thing to Hazael, to Tyre, to Rabbah, to Moab, and even to Judah. And those fires are more likely judgment than they are literal fire. But here I think the fire is literal. Verse 20, even the beasts of the field pant for you, because the water brooks are dried up, and fire has devoured the pastures of the wilderness. A drought would dry up the water brooks, but since that's a literal drying up of the drought, it's also likely that fire had devoured the pastures. And again, Joel personifies nature, saying that the beasts of the field pant for you. Remember Psalm 42, as a deer pants for flowing streams, so pants my soul for you, O God. So what have we seen? In response to the locus of life, the leaders of God's people cry out to him. The community of God's people cries out to him. Individuals who are God's people cry out to him. This is simple, repetitive, and important. Crying out to God in every difficulty, and in every opportunity for that matter, should be the reflexive response of God's people. Just as a baby or a toddler reflexively cries out, Mama, when danger or distress or pain comes into his or her life, so also God's people should reflexively turn to him in every circumstance. Now, I don't know how easy it is for you to forget this. I don't know how easy it is for most people. But I know in my own life there have been many times, to my shame, when I've forgotten or disregarded this simple truth. I've walked into, and I've even walked through difficult situations without the, oh, Lord, help. That should be reflexive. And I've looked at countless situations around me in the world, countless calamities, and even judgments, and I've said, oh, that's a shame, or maybe they got what they deserve, or, well, that could have been avoided, when I should have been on my knees crying to God. Actually, true confession, my knees hurt too much for me to pray much that way. I admire those people who can, but for me, that knees thing is a metaphor for focusing my cry on God. And that I can do, if I remember. And that we can do. We can learn to do it. If you read my book, We Never Stood Alone, you find a key theme is the reality of crying out to God individually and in community. The turning point of these characters' lives comes when they see and cry out. And I think that as fiction reflects the reality I've seen in this ministry for nearly 30 years now. I see it too, of course, in the biography of Louis Zamperini. In the early, successful part of his life, there's no prayer, no crying out. But once Zamperini is in that raft, floating across the endless Pacific Ocean, he does begin to cry out. Hillenbrand writes, their water was gone. After the B-24 had passed over, no more planes had come, and the current was carrying them far from the paths trafficked by friendly aircraft. If the search for them hadn't been called off, it would be soon. That night, before he tried to sleep, Louis prayed. He had prayed only once in his life, in childhood, when his mother was sick and he had been filled with fear that he would lose her. That night in the raft, in words composed in his head, never passing from his lips, he pleaded for help. Again, the 2-week mark was a different kind of turning point for Louis. He began to pray aloud. He had no idea how to speak to God, so he recited snippets of prayer that he'd heard in movies. Phil, who was a Christian, bowed his head as Louis spoke, offering amen at the end of every prayer. Weeks later, they went through a long spell without rainwater. On the 6th day, the men recognized that they weren't going to last much longer. Mac was failing, especially quickly. They bowed their heads as Louis prayed. If God would quench their thirst, he vowed, he'd dedicate his life to him. The next day, by divine intervention or the fickle humors of the tropics, the author says, the sky broke open and rain poured down. Twice more, the water ran out. Twice more they prayed, and twice more the rain came. Don't you love that? I'm the first to admit that at times when we cry out, we don't seem to see the specific answers, but other times God does just pour them out to meet our need, to drive back the calamities that threaten. Later, God gave Zamperini a different refreshment. On the 40th day, Louis was lying beside Phil under the canopy when he abruptly sat up. He could hear singing. It sounded like a choir. He nudged Phil and asked him if he heard anything. Phil said no. Louis slid the canopy off and squinted into the daylight. The ocean was a featureless flatness. He looked up. Above him, floating in a bright cloud, he saw human figures silhouetted against the sky. He counted 21 of them. They were singing the sweetest song he had ever heard. Louis stared up, astonished, listening to the singing. What he was seeing and hearing was impossible, yet he felt absolutely lucid. This was, he felt certain, no hallucination and no vision. He sat under the singers, listening to their voices, memorizing the melody until they faded away. Phil had heard and seen nothing. Whatever this had been, Louis concluded, it belonged to him alone. But then, when Zamperini became a Japanese prisoner, the sheer brutality of his captors quenched all evidence of God's care, and he stopped crying out, stopped praying, let go of everything except the strength of his hatred. So that when he returned home, that hatred fueled his PTSD, his descent into self-abuse and alcoholism, his broken relationships. And it's likely that that's where Louis Zamperini's story would have ended. One more drunk whose life and marriage were destroyed by the war, except for a man named Billy Graham. His Los Angeles crusade was a great work of God, and Louis Zamperini's wife, Cynthia, desperate, went to the meeting in a 600-foot tent in a dusty Los Angeles field, and she came home alight and began to cry out to God for her husband. Finally, after weeks of praying and the intervention of a neighbor, Louis agreed to go. That first night, Billy Graham said that every man had the capability for death and hatred. From his time in prison camp, Louis knew that that was true. And then Graham said, quote, "Here tonight, there's a drowning man, a drowning woman, a drowning boy, a drowning girl that is out, lost in the sea of life." And Louis knew that that was still true of him, too. But when Graham gave the invitation, Louis walked out, back to his nightly nightmare of being tortured and beaten by the bird. The next day, Cynthia argued him into going to the crusade again. That night, Graham talked about the suffering of the world and the suffering of God to save the world. What God asks of men, said Graham, is simply faith. Again, Louis wanted to walk out. When the invitation came, he pushed toward the exit. But then, as Hildebrand says, his mind was tumbling. He felt enraged, violent, on the edge of explosion. He wanted to hit someone. As he reached the aisle, he stopped. Cynthia, the rows of bowed heads, the sawdust underfoot, the tent around him all disappeared. A memory, long beaten back, the memory from which he had run the evening before, was upon him. Louis was on the raft. There was gentle Phil crumpled up before him, Mac's breathing skeleton, endless ocean stretching away in every direction, the sun lying over them, the cunning bodies of the sharks waiting, circling. He was a body on a raft dying of thirst. He felt the words whisper from his swollen lips. It was a promise thrown at heaven, a promise he had not kept, a promise he had allowed himself to forget until just this instant. If you will save me, I will serve you forever. And then, standing under that circus tent on a clear night in downtown Los Angeles, Louis felt the rain that God had given falling on him again. That was the last flashback that Louis ever had. Louis let go of Cynthia's hand. He turned toward Graham. He felt at that moment supremely alive. He began walking. "This is it," said Graham. "God has spoken to you. You come on." Now, Hildebrand calls that prayer of Louis a promise. I call it a cry, individually and corporately. We cry out to God, and God is not deaf to our prayers. He sends the rain, but he hears, as he did for Louis, he hears more in our cry than we intended. "If you'll save me, I will serve you." And years later, still, God was still answering that plea, that prayer, in the tent in Los Angeles. And that's true of us as well. He hears our cries, and we see the depths of his provision. Joel will show it to us in his day. God will show it to us in our day. This is not the end of the story, but the story starts when we cry out.